talk a little bit about the project, but we wanted to start with how we came to the question of archiving and archives, given that we're both in sociology and not history, and how that kind of led to this project. So I came to archiving through my work on Egypt, anti-colonialism in Egypt in the 50s and 60s. And I became really interested in kind of the problems with the main archives that we have. So the national state archives, as well as the colonial archives, which tend to be the two archives people turn to. And I was interested on the one hand of this question of minor histories, so histories or voices or events that don't tend to be represented in national archives or institutional archives more broadly. So questions of, the more radical strands of anti-colonialism, the feminist movement, and also people who didn't necessarily record history through written texts, for instance. So that led me to this question of the archive. How do we reimagine or rethink what an archive could be? And does that then open up completely new questions? Does it show us other histories or other actors in history that suddenly become visible through just a rearticulation of the definition of an archive? And I came to that question through also thinking of how do we actually remember something like anti-colonialism. I think for many of us, we actually remember it through things that are outside of these traditional archives, so posters, pamphlets, memories that people around us might have, letters, but also we remember it through emotion, so things like hope, promise, defeat. Hi everyone. Nice big influx. We remember it also through the emotions and kind of the big nature of that moment. So how to think of archives that capture both these ephemera, so fragments, but also the emotions of anti-colonialism, and that's how I came to this project.
And similarly, also for me, that's the other one, yeah. Right.
I think it's still,
for me also, I actually started working with traditional archives, so state archives. I visited the archive in Egypt for my earlier PhD research, and Kew here in London, the British National Archive. Obviously, if you're working on a colonial period, really, the British Archive, because of the British Empire, has a lot of the documents that we would want to do research on in the Middle East. And I was working on labor movements in the 1930s in Egypt primarily, but also a little bit on Palestine after. And then when I moved to working on Palestine, I bumped into what is known as the 1936 Arab Revolt, which was a revolt against the British presence in Palestine and against increasing settlement during this period. And most of the literature on the revolt has these depictions of strong men with weapons in the mountains and all of that. And I was particularly interested in looking at the home during these moments. So how do we remember, or how do we think about the home as a space of revolution? So I was particularly interested in women who supported the revolt in different ways and were often represented as secondary or like just giving food and water to the revolutionaries. And in order to get the material on this, obviously state archives were not very helpful, right? Because they're not really interested in the kind of the day-to-day life within a home in times of revolution. They're obviously interested in the official documents, which you will find, the letters, etc., but not in the day-to-day details within the home. And so I started looking at different forms of, other forms of archiving, like literature, film, and of course oral history. So through this project, I ended up going to Beirut, where there is a collection of the Palestine Oral History Archive, and I've interviewed the archivists who ended up producing what is now publicly accessible to everyone doing research on Palestine. And just got a sense of how to do this kind of archive. Details in terms of how to put tag words, how to make it accessible for everyone, how to organize the material in a particular way. And so this is how I ended up looking at oral history in particular, but also other forms of, art archives broadly. Now, this is how I got into that, and me and Sara, because of our common interests, both regional and also on the question of archive and archiving, we decided to kind of join forces, along with many other things that we're joining forces on, to produce this kind of open access website primarily for students who are interested in archives and archiving practices, but also for activists, researchers, artists who are interested in engaging with different forms of archive. And so we have commissioned a few submissions to this project. And we'll talk a little bit later about those particular submissions. But before that, just to kind of give you a sense of the ethos and the politics of this kind of archive, it's sort of, we called it rebel archives, not necessarily because it's about rebellions, but it's because it's rebellious in terms of form and content, in the sense of trying to disrupt the traditional archive, but also having a very expansive notion of what an archive means and what it could potentially include. So we also take seriously the collaboration. So you will find that we've invited filmmakers, musicians, academics, activists who have had some kind of archiving practice in their work. And we also take collaboration quite seriously. So we've other than collaborating with each other and all of the people who submitted, we're also working with a web designer from now to conceptualize with us how can we present something like that would be a teaching tool as well. So to start thinking about how to present this material in a way that speaks to the politics of it, but also speaks to the ethos of collaboration between art and politics and sociology and history. I should also mention that this is a pilot project, so it will be growing. We want to keep kind of having more contributions and submissions as they come along. And it sort of also, again, speaks to the ethos of the project as rejecting the traditional archives idea of completeness, whereby, okay, now we have the material and it's stored and that's it, right? This is a living process whereby people contribute and engage with it in different ways. And also, it's important for us to involve many students. So for example, in the current round, we have two of our former students from the MSc program in sociology who have submitted, and Sara will speak in more detail about their work. We're also working with three PhD students at the LSE. Yasmin is one of them, and Yasmin is working on archiving of the Syrian diaspora, and Lucy Garbett, who's working on various things, but for this project, she's going to be contributing something on archiving the nurseries in Jerusalem during the first Intifada. And Maral from the Department of International History is also going to be contributing on the archive of the Iranian leftist diaspora in San Francisco. So it's very important for us to keep kind of including students at LSE, PhDs, and different other researchers. What else did I want to say? Yeah, and just maybe I can, Sara will speak more about this kind of relationship between research and teaching as part of this project.
Yeah. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the genealogy of this project, which actually comes out of a course, and I think I wanted to really highlight that. In academia, I think we're often implicitly told that teaching is something we have to do, but that research is what kind of really matters. But I wanted to really emphasize that without that course and the amazing students every year, I think we wouldn't really have come to this project. So to really highlight that, and I know we have some students here. The course is called the Anticolonial Archive, including Babette, who was in the first year of that course, a founding member. So the Anticolonial Archive essentially is a course that tries to think about archives expansively. So what happens if we think of anything as an archive, and why it matters that we might do that. So if we're talking about anti-colonial histories that are often already marginalized, that we can't find a lot about, there is a urgency there to think outside of the box, essentially. And over the years, this is the 4th year I'm teaching it, I've really been inspired by also how students think very creatively about history in particular ways. So one of the formative assessments, for instance, is to write about an anti-colonial object, and it's been amazing to see, different, the amount of kind of objects that have come up that I think many of us would never have thought of as forms of archiving. So we've looked at things like the body as an archive, soil, music, the ocean, all of these spaces in which we start to think of as repositories of memory and of history. And I think what's come up a lot in the class is how to also produce work that then contributes to this broader project. So, of course, when you write an assessment, it's just, a few people who read it, but to really think of also how, and this is something we're talking about, how this website can become a space where we also incorporate the discussions and work in that class. That has been really important, at least to my thinking about anti-colonial archiving. So, yeah, I wanted to really emphasize that that's the genealogy of this project. And I'll also talk a little bit now about a workshop that we had actually just on Friday that came out of this project as well, where we invited two archives to speak about their archival practice. And just to note that I think what ties together all of the contributions, like Mai said, they focus on different places, questions, but what we're primarily interested in is their practice, so how they think about archives and how they go about doing this type of archival work. Often, for example, in the course, I feel like people are very open to thinking about archives differently or working with different archives, but we have much less guidance on, or we don't really have a how-to on how to think about the ocean as an archive. I mean, we know how to use the Q archives, for example, the British Library, but this website is really also an attempt to hear from people who have done this work, so that we could also maybe consider doing it. So this workshop brought together two really exciting archives. So Mayday Rooms, which some of you may know, it's very close to LSE, kind of an archive of radical movements and leftist movements, and Conflict Textiles, which is an archive of textiles that were made by women across Latin America, but particularly Chile during the dictatorship, where they documented kind of these processes of disappearance and of the violence that was happening. So we can already see that both archives have archival materials that you probably wouldn't find if you go to kind of state archives or official archives. And we, in the workshop, were asking this question of how these types of archives do different work often than maybe archives we associate with more institutional archives. So in the workshop, I'll show some pictures of here. I mean, one thing I think Maya and I talked a lot about afterwards was how different it was having the archive in the room. I think often, even in the course Anti-Colonial Archive, we talk about archives and we have photos and sounds and films, but we don't often have the archives with us. And I think these types of archives that are so also effective, I mean, they really want to bring out emotional responses. And, both archivists talked about, they think about archives in that way as well. It was such a different experience thinking about archives and having them there, but also having the types of archives that are very much about thinking of memory, emotions, history together. Obviously, one of the hallmarks of official or institutional archives is that they want to be as neutral, objective as possible. You might have an emotional response there, but it's not seen as part of what archiving actually means. Whereas these archives are very much about, yes, we want to document history, but we want to document history so that people in the present have a response to these archives and think about them and respond to them emotionally as well. And in this workshop, I think another interesting thing was how people from all over the world drew connections with these objects, even though, you know, they might be from Chile or Argentina 30 years ago. It was amazing to see how those transnational connections just very organically came up. And again, this is a very different experience from national or institutional archives where things are separated already by nation state, by time period, and it becomes difficult to actually see connections between them. So that's another strength, I think, of this type of archiving practice. But yeah, to finish off, we wanted to give you a few examples of the types of contributions that we're going to have on the website. I know we're probably very close to the end of time, but I think this is a nice kind of grounding. So yeah, maybe I'll start with the project that's being done by Kimia Talebi and Avni Ashtekar, who are both students at LSE. And this really came out of the experience of the pickets and the strike last year. And there were a lot of questions around what does it mean to archive what's happening in the present? So the strikes that have been happening for the last few years, and also the many things that, you know, the posters, the images, the food that we shared on the pickets. So they formed a group called the Radical History Working Group that was part of Decolonizing LSE, and they collectively visited the LSE archives. And they did this to try and reconnect LSE's student history or student movements to what's happening in the present. So they talk a little bit about how shocked they were to find out that LSE actually has a very rich history of student occupations, student activism. I think it was actually the first university to have a student occupation. And they were interested in why this history is not part of what you necessarily find out as a current student at LSE, and how even the LSE archives kind of present this moment as belonging to a different time. It doesn't really matter to us at the moment. So they wrote this beautiful piece that's actually a conversation between them about what it felt like to visit the LSE archives as current students and to find out about this history. They ask about what are questions that institutional archives can't answer. And they also, like this picture on the right shows, they include quite a lot on what it means to archive strikes today. What kinds of archives would we turn to if we want to remember this moment 50 years from now, for instance? And finally, I think they have this great quote where they say, community archiving is also a form of collective care. And how can we think also about the labor and work that goes into both the strikes, but also documenting them and keeping these memories alive. Great, yes, the second one I'm going to mention is by our colleague and comrade, Mavish Ahmed, who has done a lot of amazing work on archiving. But this piece is actually a piece on how friendship is part of archival projects, and talks a lot about, again, the labor of archiving. Who does the work of archiving in these community archives or these more radical archives? And she talks about a 40,000 strong collection that belongs to Ahmed Salim in Pakistan that documents Pakistan's socialist and democratic movements. And she writes that she spent 2 years working with him trying to organize this archive and make it something that people can search through and things like that. And she talks about how that commitment comes out of what she calls political friendship, and that many of these kind of community or leftist archives are dependent on that type of friendship and comradeship to exist and to survive. And we thought that that connection between friendship and comradeship and archiving was really interesting. It brings up the invisible labor that goes into many of these types of archives, the friendship, but also a commitment to keeping these archives in the space that they were created. So she mentions as well how the British Library offered to take this archive, other places in the West offered to take it and take care of it, and his commitment to keeping it actually in Pakistan so that people there could use the archive.
Okay, I'm going to talk about another submission called the Tokyo Reels, which is a really exciting project by Mohannad Yaqoubi, who's a filmmaker. And he was screening one of his films called Off Frame, aka Revolution Until Victory, in Tokyo back in 2016. And after the screening, someone approached him saying, you know, I would like to show you something. And they go to this place in Tokyo in one of the old houses there. And there's this incredible archive of films, posters, documents um, of Palestinian film, largely in Tokyo, that was collected in the 1970s and the 1980s. So they start this process of moving, he's based in Ghent, so of moving the reels from Tokyo to Ghent. And what's really interesting in the submission is that he speaks about, you know, first of all, his complete surprise of finding this amazing archive of activists in Japan who are quite invested in the Palestinian struggle in the 70s and 80s that he does not know about at all as a filmmaker working on kind of activist films, right? Some of the films in the archives would be films that many people would know, but others not. Others were Japanese, others were dubbed, subtitled. And he speaks a lot about also the politics of archiving those, like what is the how are they marked, how are they divided, and this is kind of a list of the inventory of the films. So like this is the film in Arabic, the title in Arabic, the title in Japanese, and the name of the director, and all like different countries of production. Many Palestinian films were produced elsewhere, obviously for various reasons, and really this collection, I mean, he's trying to kind of pose really interesting questions about the politics of transnational solidarity. So he asks, these are some of the questions that he asks through that submission, is that can we read the politics of solidarity by looking at a film archive? And can we write a history of solidarity by watching films? And what does it mean to screen those films today? What does it mean to screen them together, to speak about that particular history? So we can imagine a program screening this entire archive of films today to speak about transnational solidarity and to kind of draw inspiration from historical moments where these kind of alliances were there, even though they were not on the spotlight. Basically, many people don't know about them. So yeah, this is the Tokyo Reels submissions. You want to speak about this?
Yes, this is a contribution by Fawzia Ismail, who's a chef scholar, which I think is like the coolest job ever.
This is
and I regret
Sara's secret wish.
Yeah, I regret not making that choice in life. But as you can imagine, she thinks about food as an archive, and she works quite a lot on how food and the movement of food tells a story of diaspora, of politics, and she kind of came to this by thinking about the invisibility of African foods here in the UK, so in food magazines and in terms of restaurants and in those types of spaces. And she was also thinking about, and Maya and I have talked about this so many times as a potential project, but some of you might know these cassette tapes that families used to communicate with each other in the 80s, before letters, before email, and so people would record on a cassette tape and send it somewhere. And she writes about this memory about how the Somali kind of diaspora always received these cassette tapes with dried camel meat. And she uses this food memory to start a whole project called Camel Meat and Tapes, which is the project that she writes about. And in this project, she has these encounters with the Somali elders in Bristol, where she's based, where she introduces them to some of the archival objects from the Bristol Museum. And she writes about how the elders kind of were like, what is this? Why are these objects important? They're kind of everyday objects. Why are these archived? And they were a bit like dismissive of the national kind of archive and how it represents Somalia, and they were more interested actually in archiving through oral history, through storytelling. And so the project she does is actually produce a soundscape of conversations that they have together, of cooking together, of thinking about what it means to live in the UK together. And she kind of argues that this, for them, is a much more meaningful archive than the objects that they found in museums, that they just saw as very disconnected from their everyday lives. And also, I think what's really interesting here is obviously the different visions of what an archive is, or what's rendered valuable through institutional archives, but also how it builds on this idea of fragments. And I think this has come up in this project so many times, that there are no complete archives, and we should move away from trying to find complete archives, but that fragments or traces are just as important to telling these histories or telling these stories. And she's also now developed an amazing supper club, which is in Bristol, but it's also based on some of this research around how, using food as an archive, we trace disconnected histories. So, for example, the connections that existed between South Asia and East Africa during, especially during the Indian Ocean trade routes, and how food actually becomes one of the only ways that we know about those movements, because they've been erased from other histories.
So I'll speak about this is the end. Don't worry, you won't be stuck here for long. But I'll speak about another submission called the Syrian Cassette Archives, and the submission is by Yemen Miqdad, who is a musician, DJ, researcher, also filmmaker. But basically, the Syrian Cassette Archives, as you can see, it has interesting kind of 80s, 90s aesthetic to it that feels a bit strange now. But basically, this archive developed through an encounter between Yemen and his collaborator, Mark Girgis, who has, through his travels to Syria in the 90s and the early 2000s, collected a huge collection of cassette tapes in Syria. And Yemen has also had an interest in cassette tapes, and he has a big collection now that they're starting to digitize. I think they have around 1,000 new tapes. And they decided to collaborate to do this open access archive, open archive for everyone, and especially in the context of now, the Syrian, the situation in Syria with the war, and many people living in the diaspora, etc. Yeah, more of the aesthetics. So they thought it would be a good opportunity for many Syrians in particular, but also everyone, musicians, researchers interested in sound and music, to have access to those. So they have digitized many of them. They're available. You can go listen to some of them, and you can actually mimic the effect of the side A and side B of the cassettes. And what's also really interesting is that the collection has different regional types of music, right, from the coastal areas to southern Syria, and also a really big collection of Kurdish Syrian music that documents the history of Kurdish resistance and cultural defiance, etc. So it's a really rich collection. Also has folk music, has children's music, that documents a big part of from the 60s until 2010, really, where there has been a proliferation of cassette tapes. Now, of course, it's no longer the case. And the politics of this archive is also to kind of, there's a democratizing sense to it, to have this kind of accessibility to the Syrian diaspora. But also, they're very much invested in having people, musicians, researchers, keep engaging with the archive and feature this form of engagement on their website. Again, to think about the archive as this living thing that changes as people engage with it differently. And yeah, that's pretty much what we wanted to share with you. We're happy to take any questions or thoughts or comments, or if you have any cool archives you wanted to share, that would be great. Yeah, thank you all for listening.
Thank you.